let alone live in the Highlands. The family love affair with Scotland began with Queen Victoria. In 1842, she planned an exotic holiday with Prince Albert. It was their first trip north of the border.
Scotland wasn't part of the mass Victorian tourism in those days, so Victoria was very much very avant-garde in going there with Albert, and once they arrived there, people were absolutely delighted to see them. It was like a monarch going to a sort of hidden part of China today. There, people were just delighted to see them. They'd never seen people from London before, let alone the Queen.
The Times declaimed from Edinburgh,
"Nothing is now spoken of but the Queen's visit to her ancient kingdom of Scotland. It has superseded all other topics of the day."
Victoria and Albert were received by thousands of welcoming Scots, with a theatrical display of fireworks, bulls, and exaggerated Scottishness. At Drummond Castle, medieval heraldry was even hired for the visit.
She's also welcomed by 100 tenants who are carrying Lochaber axes, which is the traditional weapon of the country. That's an axe on a pole, usually about 10 feet high. Those hadn't been used in battle since the very beginning of the 18th century, and even then they were an outmoded weapon. They showed the immemorial past, the Highlands as a location of the fae, the extraordinary, the supernatural, a strange survival who had strayed into the modern age.
Queen Victoria noted,
"It seemed as if a great chieftain in old and feudal times was receiving his sovereign. It was princely and romantic."
Victoria was greeted by Scotland at its romantic best. There was tartan, and she said there were maidens dressed in their long gowns with flowers in their hair. It was a beautiful theme park, and even it seemed as if the sort of ordinary, humble people lived in far more beauty than anyone ever could.
Victoria immersed herself in every aspect of Scottishness, much to the delight of the Scots. She had her first taste of porridge, which she found very good. As for Albert, the Scottish mountains and forests reminded him of his native Germany. For the royal couple, Scotland was pure romance.
I just think there's something so potent, so irresistible about Highland Scotland, especially in terms of its sentimentalised version. It strikes all the senses and emotions. It strikes the sense of romantic history. It strikes the human sense and awareness of grandeur of scenery. This is one of the last true wildernesses of Europe, which is, if you like, an alternative to the evils and excesses of urbanism. I mean, I feel this still today, going up there.
After 2 further trips, Victoria and Albert were so seduced by Scotland that they purchased a holiday home in Aberdeenshire, Balmoral Castle. They quickly found it wasn't large enough for the entourage. In 1852, they began to build an entirely new castle with a new design. Balmoral gave Albert the opportunity to create his own vision of beauty and perfection. It was a vision that stemmed from a German upbringing.
To me, this Balmoral looks very much like a German castle. Having been to so many German castles, and it looks very much like the castles he grew up in. It has the towers. It has a fairy tale element to it. It's like the Brothers Grimm.
Balmoral's interior, too, was a romantic adventure, bedecked with tartan. This is a sitting room with tartan carpet and upholstery. The ballroom was graced with Gothic chandeliers and tartan curtains.
Albert let rip. It was Scottishness everywhere. It was a tribute to Scottishness in excess. There was tartan everywhere. Everyone complained about the decor. It was tasteless, nothing matched. It was all rather excessively a kind of pre-Disney version of Scotland, and Victoria and Albert thought it was marvellous.
Queen Victoria wrote,
"The house is charming, the rooms delightful, the furniture, papers, everything perfection."
Yet the tartan paradise they had created was packed with irony. Tartan was associated with a Scottish royal line, the Stuarts.
Victoria sees herself, as she puts it, as the heir of the Stuarts, the heir of that unhappy race. Her Scotland is a Scotland where she is the inheritor of a long-standing past.
Despite declaring herself a Stuart, it was Victoria's great-great-grandfather, George II, who had massacred Stuart supporters, the Jacobites, at Culloden. He even made the wearing of Stuart symbols of the uprising, such as tartan, illegal.
One government commentator had it in 1747 in referring to the Disarming Act, and particularly to the controls over traditional Highland dress. "This is an instrument for disarming and undressing those ruffians, because these were regarded as, if you like, the sartorial manifestations, the manifestations in dress of disaffection, of rebellion, of treason.
By the end of the 18th century, as well as state oppression, Highland people saw massive agricultural change and brutal evictions from their land.
When you go to the Highlands today, people always comment upon it as a beautiful wilderness, but it's far from a beautiful wilderness. It's a derelict landscape. In Highland Scotland, because you didn't get industrialisation, because you didn't get an alternative to land, it eventually brought distress, destitution, mass emigration, famine.
Some Scots rejected the dereliction by romanticising the old world of the rebellious Jacobites. No one did more to reinvent the past and glamorise Highland culture than the writer Sir Walter Scott, author of Waverley, Ivanhoe and Rob Roy.
There's plenty of passages that I think it's utterly forgivable to let your eye glide over. There's some descriptions of Heather that I don't think I've ever quite read through entirely.
Where glistening streamers waved and danced, the wanderer's eye could barely view the summer heaven's delicious blue, so wondrous wild, the whole might seem the scenery of a fairy dream.
Walter Scott himself remarked that what makes Scotland Scotland is fast disappearing. Henry Lord Coburn, the great intellectual lawyer, this is the last truly Scotch age. So there was a hunt on, if you like, to retain a sense of cultural identity, while at the same time retaining the Union.
By the early 1800s, Scotland had become an intellectual and economic powerhouse, but Walter Scott created an intoxicating image of pastoral romance. In London, the young Victoria had become obsessed by Scott's vision. The first novel she ever read was his Bride of Lammermoor.
And there's no question that Sir Walter Scott sort of lit the fire in Victoria's heart that developed into her great love of Scotland. We think of this sort of dumpy little widow, but that wasn't the young queen at all. You know, she was passionate about everything. And the moment she saw it, she felt she'd come home. I think Sir Walter Scott created in her a curiosity to see Scotland that, led her there maybe the sooner.
Her new husband, Prince Albert, also loved reading Scott's novels. In Germany, editions had been pirated, they were so popular. Throughout Europe, a new romanticism took hold. One German composer, Mendelssohn, had fallen in love with Scotland and befriended Victoria and Albert.
Mendelssohn's Fingal's Cave is a fantasia on Scottish themes. And I think that phrase, a fantasia on Scottish themes, summarises the whole project that Scotland was going through in the 19th century, from the Waverley novels to Balmoral. These were fantasias on Scottish themes.
By 1855, the newly built Balmoral was ready to be lived in by its royal owners. Amidst this Scottish fantasy, Victoria's diary entries lengthened, reflecting her deep passion for Balmoral.
Every year, my heart becomes more fixed in this dear paradise, and so much more so now that all has become my dearest Albert's own creation. Own work, own building, own laying out.
But not everyone thought it to be the paradise she did. Lady-in-waiting Augusta Bruce observed with reticence,
A certain absence of harmony of the whole. Well, looking at old photographs, Victorian Balmoral was slightly cluttered, like all of Victoria's palaces and spaces. It was full of antlers and deer's heads everywhere, particularly in the hall. And some of the rooms were terribly small, so that people who went to stay there were sort of shoved into these tiny rooms, particularly at the beginning. You get ministers complaining that they're forced to write their dispatches on their bed because there's no desk in their room. There's just... it's such a tiny space.
Comparing it to another royal home, politician Lord Rosebery observed,
The drawing room at Osborne was the ugliest in the world until I saw the one at Balmoral. I personally think that Balmoral is a gruesome house. Totally charmless. No grandeur, no distinction. Big, ugly, dull, oppressive.
but for Victoria, it was a dream house in which she could play out her fantasy.
I think in Balmoral, Victoria was making a Waverley novel you could live in. From the exterior to the decoration inside, I think Scott would have loved Balmoral. It's such a shame he didn't live to see it. I mean, he would probably have made it even more romantic and slightly phony.
The royal family had also been attracted to some Spartan conditions. The outside cold could drop as low as minus 27 degrees centigrade, giving the monarchy the chance to battle the elements.
One of the interesting things about Balmoral is it's absolutely freezing. Braemar is, which is of course very, very close indeed to Balmoral, is the coldest part of Great Britain. So it is a very, very, very cold place. So it was a brave place to choose, and certainly was in its own way a struggle with nature on the part of the royal family.
Victoria loved the cold. There was nothing more Victoria-like than a nice, chilly day. In fact, she would constantly throw the windows open all the time and leaving the ladies-in-waiting shivering in their fine silks. In fact, the Tsar claimed that Balmoral was colder than the wastes of Siberia, and Lord Clarendon claimed he had frostbite in his feet from having to be in Balmoral because it was just so cold.
It's always raining there. It rains morning, noon and night. It just rains horizontally, seldom vertically. They have rude rain up there, as the locals call it. It doesn't go round you, it goes through you. The rain there circulates in the air for hours at a time because it just blows horizontally and doesn't ever touch the ground, so you can meet the same squall 2 or 3 times in the same day. Miserable place.
Victoria relished conquering the cold on her frequent walks in the hills. Austere picnics were almost a daily occurrence.
We sat on a very precipitous place, and here, at a little before 2 o'clock, we lunched. The luncheon was very acceptable, for the air was extremely keen.
They went out in all weather, on sort of pony rides, on sort of picnics, on these great expeditions. I mean, Queen Victoria wrote about it at length, describing these wonderful, rather romantic expeditions. I mean, the reality was, I think, that it was terribly cold, and when it wasn't cold, there were awful midges.
On these excursions, the royal family would meet the locals. Albert thought the Highlanders looked like Germans.
The people are more natural and are marked by that honesty and sympathy which always distinguish the inhabitants of mountainous countries who live far away from towns.
The locals, for their part, seemed only too happy to wear the kilt, to put on a display of Scottishness for their queen.
I think Victoria's clear, authentic love of Scotland plays very well in Scotland. It's going to be a very, she's bound to be a very popular figure because of that, and she is. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Scotland was also moulding Victoria and Albert. Within the walls of Balmoral, they wanted to reinvent themselves as Scots. The tartan extended from Balmoral's carpets to the royal attire. Even the workers were required to wear plaid.
Yes, Queen Victoria and Albert were 50 years behind the times when it came to fashion, and that continues in the royal family to this day in many ways. And it was a sort of perhaps historical thinking or traditional thinking. They didn't want to be fashionable, they didn't want to compete with London society. The family apparently took to wearing kilts for dinner, and Albert designed his own special tartans just for the pair of them. And this is almost a type of patriotism, because up until then, the best fashions were always French fashions. And here was Victoria saying, we don't want French chefs. We don't want French fashions, French lace, all this stuff. I want tartan and I want porridge.
Balmoral gave the monarchy the opportunity not only to create their own style, but reinvent the world in which they lived. Far from the riots and stench of London, they could create a new model society.
Balmoral gives them a chance to run a sort of medieval fairy tale in many ways, because they can exert patronage, they are peasant people living around, they can visit them in their huts. It's escapism.
Courtier Charles Greville remembered the daily activities of the Queen.
She is running in and out of the house all day long, and often goes about alone, walks into the cottages, and sits down and chats with the old women.
There was a huge nostalgia in the 1830s and 40s for the Middle Ages, for the dream of order, for the wholesome feudal loyalties that had existed in the Middle Ages. So Queen Victoria was going up and seeing all these marvellous Scottish things and saying, this is what I like, because it actually helps the whole business of loyalty to the Crown, and the Crown is part of that great tradition.
Nowhere was this feudalism more evident than at the Highland Games.
Throwing the hammer, tossing the caber, putting the stone. We gave prizes to the 3 best in each of the games.
Victoria and Albert were great fans of the Highland Games. Hale, hearty subjects throwing things around and seeming as if this was the epitome of British strength. They could just chuck cabers and that sort of thing. It was all perfect. Victoria herself was kind of almost like some kind of chieftain, and the Queen but I'm also the tartan-clad chieftain of all of you.
I think with Victoria and the Highland Games, you have a kind of idea of honorary feudalism. It is to an extent dressing up and playing the role. There's no real power there. I mean, if you think about it by analogy, it's perfectly safe to dress up as a Viking or a Jacobite or a knight from the Middle Ages. It's only in these kind of dead costumes that the ceremonial can find its chance to relive the days of power.
Balmoral also provided another theatrical backdrop against which to play the role of a royal, the animal kingdom.
Victoria loved animals and she loved nature. As a little girl, she loved her ponies, she loved her animals, as do our current royal family. And there were animals everywhere. There were stags all over the place. This was a place of great nature.
As for Albert,
Albert was an extraordinarily bad hunter. He went out in a day's deer hunting and came back with a hare. He got himself betrayed spearing salmon, which is one of the most difficult, with a leister, with a fish spear, it's one of the most difficult ways you can have to catch fish. He was reliving the past in doing that. And once he got so frustrated that when he was at breakfast with his host and his tamed stag came to the window to be fed, Albert shot him.
He didn't go into the sort of rather more delicate British habit of just killing the occasional thing. He wanted a massacre.
The stag is first used as a symbol of the Stuart dynasty under siege in Denham Cooper's Hill, where the killing of the stag is symbolically seen as the killing or the attack on Charles I. So in actually hunting the deer in Scotland was both, in a sense, symbolically killing off the Stuart dynasty, but realising the inheritance of the Scottish royal family back to its earliest foundation myths.
Albert's conquests of nature were presented to the monarch as immortalised in oil paintings. The English artist Landseer created the ideal stag in the monarch of the glen.
I think nobility, dignity, honour, integrity, the stag possesses all these things. And the hunter, in pursuing them, is outwitting the creature. And the difficulty in outwitting the creature is an important part of that. And Landseer and Victoria get on very well. I think Landseer is important in nurturing that Highland sensibility in Victoria. He instructs Victoria in drawing and watercolour. So Landseer's painting, I think, just becomes part of the package of the Highlands for Victoria. It calls to mind everything about the Highlands that she values.
Balmoral has even given us a new term, coined in Victorian times, Balmorality, signifying a combination of patronage, respectability, Scottishness, and the great outdoors.
Balmorality, a very important concept, because, as has been often said, the crown is the symbol of ourselves behaving well. And if people who have the crown upon their heads behave badly, it shakes the whole foundations of the throne and of the monarchy.
It was the values of moderation and respectability that enamoured Victoria to the Presbyterian Scots.
She was respected because she was a mother. She was serious. She seemed to embody the values that particularly middle-class Scotland agreed with. So she was very much an icon, and she was incredibly popular.
Balmoral's influence spread far. In Victoria's wake, English aristocrats adopted her rituals in Scotland.
I remember once seeing on the front of Tatler after a particularly grievous general election result in the 1990s, seeing this thing that this headline which said, "How we love our Highland playground." And you know, this has been the sort of attitude of the sort of high British establishment to Scotland ever since Victoria's day. That Scotland is this little bit on the edge where you go in August and where you shoot and where there's lots and lots of empty land with nobody much in it, and where one has one's sort of shooting and hunting and fishing kind of holiday.
As novelist Anthony Trollope would later write, in the shooting season dukes were more plentiful than in Pall Mall. The middle-class English too were keen to explore this new landscape. Thomas Cook tours to Scotland started in 1846, with hundreds flocking to see the world of Walter Scott, and now Queen Victoria. Balmoral had helped create a Highland brand. Rather than a modern industrialised nation, Scotland had become dramatic glens and Highland cattle.
I
think that Victoria and Albert popularised that romantic conception of the Highlands tremendously. I think by buying Balmoral and remodelling it the way she did, and repeatedly coming back to Scotland, and the value that she placed on Scotland gave tremendous impetus to that Highland identity.
The tartan industry also took off. By covering Balmoral with tartan and adorning those around her within it, Victoria promoted the once illegal Highland dress.
You know, if the most famous Scotsman in the world nowadays is a character from The Simpsons that wears a kilt, has red hair, a fiery temper and drinks too much whiskey, we can't wholly blame Scott and Victoria for that, but they certainly set the sort of preconditions whereby that idea of Scottishness became an international brand.
Balmoral had also become a symbol of the union of the two countries, empowering both the monarchy and Scotland.
This is perhaps unique to Victoria's reign, that by her period the monarchy had become an additional keystone, an additional important support of union, in a way which monarchy had not been before, because it was this kind of symbolic representation of Britishness on the one hand, but the great thing for the Scots was that she was proud of, and tried in a sense, in a very explicit sense, not only by her visitation, but by her love for Scotland, to recognise Scotland's identity within the Union.
In 1861, Prince Albert became seriously ill. As Albert lay dying, Victoria read him Walter Scott's Peveril of the Peak.
There's a very touching copy of the Waverley novels in the Windsor Library, where you can see the copy of Peveril of the Peak that she was reading to Albert on his deathbed, and they put a black border around the very page that he died on. It's not a very good page. I mean, you can see why he didn't want to get to the end of the book.
While Victoria grieved for Albert, Aberdeen churches prayed for the Queen in her bereavement.
Well, after Albert died, Queen Victoria was devastated. And that meant that she really refused to accept that anything moved on or changed after Albert died. And so Balmoral became a kind of, sort of museum. Balmoral became a much more sort of joyless place. And the children, well, certainly the Prince of Wales used to rather hate going there, because it was also sort of strict and regimented and gloomy.
Visitors were similarly ill at ease with the sombre atmosphere of Balmoral. Politician Henry Campbell Bannerman remarked,
"It is the funniest life conceivable. Like a convent. We meet at meals, and when we have finished, each is off to his cell."
For Tsar Nicholas II,
"The weather is awful. Rain and wind every day, and on top of it, no luck at all. I haven't killed a stag yet."
For the rest of her life, Victoria retreated more and more to Balmoral. Away from state and society, she found comfort in the world of Balmorality she had created with Albert. On the 22nd of January 1901, the hands on the local church were stopped at 6:30 p.m. Queen Victoria had died. It was the end of an era. But Victoria could never have predicted how Balmoral would become a testing ground for all future royal behaviour, including that of the new king.
Edward VII's main enjoyments were fornication and food. Plenty of food at Balmoral, but not much in the way of fornication, and I think he was grateful to get back to London. His figure did not allow him to do anything very energetic. He enjoyed shooting, but very kind of static shooting. And to imagine King Edward VII crawling over the hills in search of a stag is very hard to conceive. Edward VII was the antithesis of Balmorality. He wasn't called Edward the Caresser for nothing. He was a prince of pleasure. He was Kipling called him a corpulent voluptuary. And I think he was the opposite of his mother in that sense. He lived for pleasure rather than for duty.
Rather than reading Sir Walter Scott, the king described Balmoral's library as the mausoleum of the great unread.
I think that Edward VII insisted on very strict standards of behaviour when he became king. But of course there's always a slight sort of double standard, because at the same time as this is going on, everybody knows, and it's public knowledge, that the king has a sort of official mistress in the shape of Mrs. Keppel. She doesn't stay at Balmoral. I don't think that she often comes over to lunch at Balmoral. I think with Edward VII it was all about public appearances.
Edward VII hadn't lived up to the Victorian rules of Balmoral. But his son, George V, was perfectly suited to uphold Balmorality.
George V was, of all the 20th century monarchs, the one to whom Balmoral meant most, I think. He was probably the most conservative with a small c monarch that had been for, except perhaps for Queen Victoria in her declining years. There has been no British monarch has come within striking distance of him for total, rooted, dogmatic conservatism.
I love a gun, but I am never so happy as when I am fishing the pools of the Dee with a long day before me.
With George V, there's a big change in the atmosphere. Lord Yesha, who was one of Edward VII's sort of favourite courtiers and was at Balmoral a lot with Edward VII, and he said the first time that he went there, it's now totally domestic, and it's too awful because Queen Mary spends her evenings knitting.
In 1936, Balmoral was to be shaken once again with the new king, Edward VIII. He was more at home with the French Riviera and London cocktail parties than he was at Balmoral.
If you do not like walking in the hills, if you do not like fishing, if you do not like stalking, if you do not like shooting, Balmoral is not the ideal place. It is totally ill-designed for the jet set. King Edward VIII was a jet set for the jets. He was a walking jet set, and there was no place in Balmoral where the jet set could be accommodated.
Edward also rejected the Balmoral code of respectability by immersing himself in a love affair with American socialite Wallace Simpson. In contrast, his younger brother Albert, the future King George VI, loved the outdoor life, predictability, and stability that Balmoral provided. Albert also loved all things Scottish, and in particular, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of the Earl of Strathmore. Unlike the urban Wallace Simpson, Elizabeth was a natural Balmoralite.
She embraced Scottish country life and everything it had to offer, so she was taught to fish by one of her father's gillies when she was very young, and she became an expert fly fisher. In fact, she often got a fishbone stuck in her throat, and she used to call it the salmon's revenge.
In September 1936, the clash between King Edward's world of glamour and the Balmoral establishment came to a head. Not only had Edward spent much of the summer cruising the Med, but he dared invite his American divorcee lover, Wallace Simpson, to Balmoral. Wallace was horrified at the tartan furnishings, declaring,
This tartan has to go.
Mrs. Simpson looked thoroughly out of place in Balmoral. She was dressed to the nines always, as if she was about to walk out onto the lawns of Hurlingham or somewhere. It was so totally alien to her whole place. The mere existence of King Edward VIII in the mood in which he was in 1936 was a threat to the way of life of Balmoral, a threat to the way of life of the royal family.
When the Metropolitan Wallace met Elizabeth, the very essence of Balmorality, the monarchy collided with the modern world.
Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and Wallace Simpson were chalk and cheese. They couldn't have been more different. They disliked each other, and Wallace Simpson famously called Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon that Scottish cook. She used to call her Cookie, in fact. If she thought she looked so plain and ordinary, she might be a member of staff.
There's a little story about how the Duchess of York, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother-to-be, came to Balmoral with Wallace Simpson acting as hostess. And she swept past her, and she said, "I've come to dine with the King." In other words, she was still loyal to her brother-in-law Edward VIII, but she didn't want any truck with this two-bit American adulteress, adventuress, whatever she was, who was cutting at the root of the monarchy by having this affair with the King.
The King and Mrs. Simpson would never return to Balmoral. The establishment had rejected them. They had failed the Balmoral litmus test. With Edward's abdication, Balmorality remained intact. And with the crowning of George VI, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became Queen, much to the delight of the Scots.
The fact that George V married a Scot is very important, because the Scots tended to be very acquisitive about who they defined as Scottish. And of course that effectively meant that they could claim that the heir to the throne was effectively half Scottish.
And with Queen Elizabeth's firstborn, Balmoral culture would be embraced with a passion not seen since Queen Victoria.
Elizabeth II was really a countrywoman at heart. I think she's famous for saying, when I grow up I want to marry a farmer and have lots of horses and dogs and children. I think she identified with Queen Victoria. And certainly her father, George VI, used to say when she was quite young, well, we often wonder whether history will repeat itself, meaning that the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, would turn out to be a queen in the mould of Queen Victoria.
In post-war Britain, society changed and the country modernised, while in the Highlands of Scotland, the Queen's own castle remained just as it had ever been.
I would say that, taking into account obvious changes and modern conveniences, but life in Balmoral is in essentials extraordinarily similar to what it was 100 or 150 years ago. That the pattern of life was laid down in the 19th century, what you did, when you did it, and though now they've got Land Rovers and now they've got electric lights, basically they are doing the same things in more or less the same way as they were doing when Queen Victoria was there.
Since Victoria's time, Balmoral has become more than a retreat. It replenishes the royal family's identity, renewing their most important values. Photographer Ken Lennox has seized opportunities to see these ideals in action. On one occasion, the Queen was on the moors, every inch the noble chief with her subjects, just as Queen Victoria had been.
The Queen was dressed in raincoats, sturdy shoes, ankle socks and a hood. And she would mix for the 3 or 4 hours amongst her own people up there. And at one stage, she was introduced to one of her shepherds, or she had called on the shepherd. And he ends up leaning on his crook with both hands, as if it was anybody else. And they're just so natural. Here's the Queen and one of her shepherds just having a jaw up in the hills.
Queen Victoria dictated that tartan was to be worn at Balmoral. Today, the royal family still wear this symbol of Scottishness.
What you see when you see Prince Charles in a kilt at Balmoral is a man determined not to yield to the fads of modern Britain. You also see, I think, a royal family playing hard Scottish card, trying to keep the United Kingdom together.
Pageantry of another kind in Scotland. At Braemar there are pipers.
At the Highland Games, the royal family can firmly put their Scottishness on display. Now attracting huge crowds, the clansmen still test their physical strength and hail the reigning monarch as chieftain.
When the Queen and Prince Philip attend the Braemar Games, it's part of a huge fantasy in which the royals are engaged. It's a great pageant of the past because they're not Scottish, they are German mainly, and they are engaging in something which is supposed to unite them with their people. It's supposed to bring them together with their people.
Like Victoria, the royal family enjoy escapism, but they are no fair-weather tourists. A courtier once said,
"The royal family will go out in weather you wouldn't put a dog out in."
As in Victoria's time, the royal family avoid indulgence at Balmoral. Instead, Tupperware picnics are nearly a daily occurrence.
The picnics at Balmoral are curiously like Marie Antoinette in the Petit Trianon, pretending to be a dairymaid, and they are a wonderful mixture of comfort, informality, and a wonderful, efficient machine driving them all from behind. You could say, in a way, it is the royal family playing at the ordinary human beings, and there is some truth in that.
Salad is ready.
Lady-in-waiting Margaret Rhodes spent many holidays at Balmoral in the company of the Queen.
Prince Philip is an extremely good chef, and he does the cooking. And the Queen makes the salad. There's nobody else there in the way of help. So it's usually probably birds that have been shot out. I mean, lovely roast grouse or venison steaks. And then they have those enormous sausages called the Cumberland sausages, which go on round and round and round forever, What's this for? What's this for?
Well, picnics are taken very seriously at Balmoral. Prince Philip not only designed a barbecue, he designed a trailer for the barbecue, and everything was done with strict order. If it wasn't done properly, there'd be a lot of shouting from Prince Philip and sometimes from the Queen too. And the Queen would play her part by making the salad dressing.
Hunting and fishing remain important rituals at Balmoral. To conquer nature is an important part of being royal. Following in Albert's footsteps, Prince Charles often stands alone in the icy River Dee. Stag hunting is also a favourite pastime.
Charles is a very serious man in the sense that his shooting's not frivolous. I mean, if they shoot a deer, it will be part of the menu for the household and for the royals themselves. He is prepared to spend days at a time going after one red deer.
Official visitors have largely played along with this lifestyle. Prime ministers are exposed to Balmorality when they trek to Scotland every year.
I think at the start, always, a Prime Minister goes with trepidation. Yikes, a weekend with the royal family. How is this going to be socially?
Nice to see you.
They're people whose whole life revolves around the written word, behind gossip, behind ideas. And they go up to Balmoral and find a world where really ideas aren't regarded as particularly exciting unless it's the idea of what's going to be for lunch.
He keeps it very tidy too. This is their shed.
One Prime Minister in particular was never entirely comfortable with Balmorality.
I think her sister wrote that she'd never had any shoes apart from patent leather court shoes, and they went with her to Balmoral. And there's been absolute struggle between the ladies-in-waiting and Thatcher, how they could get her into country shoes. And I think they even managed to get her into green Wellington boots.
There is this terrible cliché when people think about Mrs. Thatcher and the Queen that they didn't get on. There is strong evidence to suggest that actually they got on, because Mrs. Thatcher once gave the Queen for Christmas a set of washing up gloves, a pair of marigolds. And that's because she'd seen the Queen at Balmoral washing up without gloves. And Mrs. T, being Mrs. T, thought you can't wash up without washing up gloves. And so she sent Her Majesty a pair of yellow gloves, plastic.
I think she found the whole thing boring and beyond belief. She kept saying, I must govern, you know, and when Rupert Murdoch heard that she was going out to Balmoral, he said, oh, how boring for her. And I'm sure that reflected her own feeling. I mean, it's notorious that when it was time to leave, you know, she'd been packed and ready to go hours before the off, because she was so eager to get away from the place.
As for Cherie Blair, she was the very antithesis of Balmorality, as encapsulated in an unfortunate pose.
What a photograph it is. It is of a moose in its maternity throes. It is of, I don't know, a cross-channel ferry opening its cargo gates. And she plainly is bored rigid by the Balmoral weekend. Here were the Blairs. They had sprung from metropolitan Islington. They were people whose whole life had revolved around urban conceits and fantasies and interests. Cherie, if told she had to go out in the pouring rain, we're going for a walk, Mrs. Blair. What, in that? You can just imagine it. And then the thought of a barbecue, the sort of burnt sausages. It's not easy, is it, to see how this could have been overcome. But this is part of the comedy of our rulers, isn't it?
Urban politicians have never been expected to understand the royal rituals in the great outdoors. But royal family members are still required to pass the test that is Balmoral.
I came across Prince Charles fishing and I saw there was a girl with him. Later on in the day, we found out it was Diana Spencer, who was the younger sister of a former girlfriend. So we didn't really pay too much attention. Coming back down the plane that weekend, there was a member of the royal party on the plane who said, don't ignore her. That's all he said, don't ignore her.
The following year, Diana and Prince Charles married. They spent part of their honeymoon at Balmoral. Diana joined in the traditions, even shooting a stag.
Diana never liked Balmoral, but she pretended to. She pretended to like it so much that Prince Charles really believed she loved it and thought this is terrific. But Diana was absolutely miserable. She hated the formality. She hated the fact that she was actually having part of her honeymoon with her mother-in-law. She hated the picnics. She hated the weather. Hated the rain. And, you know, she went into a real deep depression.
Initially, Diana passed the royal test with a facade of Balmorality.
She turned up in this tartan dress with a little Glengarry hat on, and arrived at Braemar Games. She looked sensational. She looked happy. She looked everything a princess should look like. And she had bowed to the royal bit. Charles was there in his kilt and she was there in this tartan dress. She looked sensational.
But it wasn't long before her deep rejection of Balmoral began to show.
She didn't get on really at all with the kind of rather Spartan existence that they lived up there. Diana was an English rose, really, and I suppose she thought Charles was a Scottish thistle. She described as boring, 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 and she clamped her walkman on her head and tried to keep away from the whole thing.
At the Braemar Games, with Balmorality on view, Diana's impatience with the rigid mechanisms of monarchy increasingly revealed itself.
Well, as a Scot, even as a Scot, Braemar Games are boring. If you've ever seen a film of the Braemar Games, the whole day is condensed into about 3 minutes, and none of that's very exciting. If you've seen one man tossing a caber, it's quite exciting the first time, and maybe even the second time, but after that, it's not very exciting to be there. When she got to Braemar Games for her second visit, she had spent quite some considerable time at Balmoral Castle, and had been there solidly without a break. So she was stuck around the castle playing Ludo with Prince Andrew, which, couldn't have been a lot of fun. The royals can be deadly dull at the time, and Diana was, as everyone knows, is a bright cosmopolitan girl.
Diana, like Edward VIII before her, had refused to reinvent herself as a Balmoral woman, embracing metropolitan values instead. For Charles, as his marriage disintegrated, Balmoral became a refuge, as it had been for Victoria. In 1987, Charles spent several weeks at Balmoral without seeing Diana or the children. It was this very isolation that would haunt the royal family after the 31st of August 1997. The royal family, including Charles, William and Harry, were in Balmoral the night Diana died. The week after, as public emotion poured out in London, the English people were dismayed that the Queen stayed in Scotland, while so many grieved in London. 500 miles north, the royal family eventually made it outside to Balmoral's gates.
I think just for a moment, for a week or so, they just couldn't understand what was happening. They were sitting in another country, in a tartan castle, with all the wrong iconography about them, and not responding to the cries of the kind of people of London, really, who are always the mob, the crowd, on whom a British monarchy first depends. And they couldn't understand that those people too had a different set of needs from what they'd had in 1950. They weren't any longer a kind of class of people in bowler hats going to the city with stiff upper lips and accepting the old British way. They had totally changed. It was really a close thing.
Diana's death illuminated Balmoral's place on the British stage. Just as Victoria's love of Balmoral had once symbolised the Union, now the castle represented isolation and two nations growing apart. The monarchy, once shaped by Scotland, now faced an increasingly independent nation.
One of the reasons I would argue why the Union is not quite as strong as it was in this new millennium is because the monarchy doesn't have the same influence today as it had perhaps in previous generations.
Within 2 years of Diana's death, Balmorality was challenged once again. In a historic moment, the Queen opened the first Scottish Parliament for nearly 300 years.
Scotland is all this, and so much more. The grit, determination and humour, the forthrightness, and above all, the strong sense of identity of the Scottish people. Qualities which contribute so much to the life of the United Kingdom. And these qualities reflect to Scotland, which, if I may make a personal point, occupies such a special place in my own and my family's affections.
I remember seeing her later in the day, and I don't think I've ever seen a woman look more exhausted. She was fine, and she was doing her duty and going around the reception and everything, but she looked completely drained. And it occurred to me that at that moment she had been holding in herself. I suppose for her it was a matter of holding together the whole history of the family and the monarchy over the last 300 or 400 years, that she had to not put a foot wrong, she had to say the right things, she had to not create a situation that would actually blow the whole